I thought I was just restoring an old truck for my late grandfather, but when I fired up that 1975 Harley Davidson pickup for the first time in decades, I had no idea it would bring a complete stranger to my doorstep in tears, carrying a story that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Cordelia Mitchell, but everyone calls me Cora. I'm 28 years old, and I've got grease permanently embedded under my fingernails and calluses on my palms that tell the story of every engine I've ever brought back to life. 6 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's auto shop in the kind of small Nebraska town where everybody knows your business before you do. And the grain elevator is the tallest building for 50 miles in any direction. Growing up, I was the kid who preferred socket wrenches to dolls, who could diagnose engine trouble by sound before I was old enough to reach the pedals. While other girls my age were learning to braid friendship bracelets, I was learning to rebuild carburetors in my grandfather Bo's shop. He was the one who taught me that every machine has a heartbeat, and if you listen close enough, it'll tell you exactly what's wrong and exactly how to fix it. Bo Mitchell wasn't just my grandfather. He was the guy everyone in town brought. Their broken-down tractors, too. The man who could make a 1960 Chevy purr like it just rolled off the assembly line. He had hands that could coax life out of the most hopeless pile of rust and metal, and a patience that never wavered, even when I accidentally dropped his favorite wrench down the storm drain when I was 12. But here's what I didn't know about my grandfather until after he was gone. Hidden in the back corner of his shop, covered by a paint-stained tarp that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades, sat this truck. A 1975 Harley Davidson pickup, painted in a faded orange that probably used to be bright enough to stop traffic. The chrome bumper was spotted with rust, the tires were flat, and weeds had actually started growing up through a crack in the concrete around it. I'd walked past that corner 1,000 times growing up, and Bo had always just said it was a project for another day. When I asked him about it, he'd get this distant look in his eyes, like he was seeing something I couldn't, and then he'd change the subject to whatever carburetor we were working on. After the funeral, when I was going through his things, trying to figure out how to keep the business running and honor his memory at the same time, I finally pulled back that tarp. What I found underneath didn't make any sense. This wasn't just some old truck that had been sitting around collecting dust. Every bolt, every wire, every component had been carefully preserved. The engine bay was spotless, like someone had been maintaining it regularly, but never actually driving it. The keys were hanging on a hook right next to it, which seemed strange for a vehicle that looked abandoned. When I climbed into the cab, the leather seats were cracked but clean, and there was this smell I couldn't place. Not the usual musty odor you'd expect from a truck that hadn't run in years, but something else, something that reminded me of my grandfather, but different somehow. I'm a practical person. I've had to be, especially these last 6 months trying to keep the shop afloat on my own. When you're facing bank statements that make your stomach turn and equipment that's older than you are, you learn to focus on what needs fixing right now, not on mysteries that don't pay the bills. But this truck was different. Every time I looked at it, I felt like Bo was trying to tell me something. So I made a decision that probably wasn't the smartest financial move I've ever made. Instead of selling it as is to the first person who'd throw me some quick cash, I decided to restore it properly. I told myself it was purely business. A fully restored 1975 Harley pickup would bring in enough money to keep the lights on for another few months, maybe even long enough to figure out a real solution to my problems. I had no way of knowing that bringing this truck back to life would unlock secrets about my grandfather I never suspected. I couldn't have imagined that the distinctive rumble of its engine would reach the ears of a man 70 miles away. A man who'd been waiting 48 years to hear that sound again. And I definitely never could have predicted that 3 days after I posted pictures of the restored truck online, Vincent Castellano would appear at my shop with tears in his eyes and a story that would reveal who my grandfather really was. All I knew was that I had to hear that engine run one more time, the way Bo would have wanted it to. I just didn't realize that sometimes when you bring something back to life, it brings something back to you too. The morning I decided to restore that truck, I was sitting in Bo's old office chair, staring at a stack of bills that seemed to multiply every time I looked away. The numbers didn't lie, and they weren't kind. 6 months after inheriting Mitchell's auto repair, I was drowning in expenses I'd never had to think about when I was just the granddaughter who helped out after school and on weekends. Rent on the building, insurance, utilities, equipment maintenance, taxes I didn't even know existed, until they showed up in my mailbox with red stamps and threatening language. Bo had handled all of this invisible work while I focused on the fun part, the part where you get your hands dirty and make broken things whole again. Now I understood why he sometimes looked so tired at the end of the day, even when we'd spent hours doing what we both loved. The shop felt different without him. Too quiet, too big, like a church after the congregation has gone home. Every tool still hung in its designated spot on the pegboard, exactly where Bo had placed it. His coffee mug still sat on the workbench, permanently stained from years of truck stop coffee and early morning starts. I couldn't bring myself to move any of it, which meant I was basically living in a museum of my grandfather's life while trying to build my own. My brother Thaddeus showed up every Wednesday like clockwork, bringing takeout from the diner and opinions I didn't ask for. Thad works in insurance in Omaha, wears ties that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month, and has never met a problem he couldn't solve with a spreadsheet and a firm handshake with the right person. "You're being stubborn, Cora," he'd said just the week before, picking at his chicken fried steak while I tried to concentrate on rebuilding a transmission. "Bo's gone. The shop was his dream, not yours. You could sell this place, move to the city, work for a real auto company. They're hiring women mechanics now. You could have benefits, vacation time, a 401k. The thing about Thad is that he means well, but he's never understood that some things can't be measured in dollars and cents. He sees the shop as real estate and assets. I see it as the place where Bo taught me that patience and skill can resurrect what everyone else has given up on. Where I learned that the most satisfying sound in the world is an engine starting up after you've spent weeks convincing it to trust you again. My only real ally was Millicent Hartwell, who lived in the house next to the shop and had been bringing me coffee and unsolicited advice since I was tall enough to see over the counter. Millie was 73, had buried 2 husbands, and possessed the kind of directness that only comes from having survived 8 decades without bothering to apologize for taking up space in the world. "Your grandfather always said you had the gift," she told me one Tuesday morning, setting down a thermos of coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Not just for fixing engines, but for understanding what people need. Half the folks who brought their cars here could have gone to that chain place out by the highway. They came here because Bo made them feel like their problems mattered. The truth was, I was scared. Not of hard work or long hours or dirty fingernails, but of failing. Of proving that maybe Thad was right, maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Every day I didn't have a customer was another day closer to the bank deciding I wasn't worth the risk. Every night I lay awake doing math that never added up the way I needed it to. That's when I started really looking at the truck, not just glancing at it when I walked by, but studying it. The way Bo had positioned it in that corner wasn't random. It was protected, sheltered, like he was keeping it safe for something. The tarp wasn't just thrown over it either. It was tucked and secured, the way you'd cover something precious. I needed money, and that truck represented the biggest single asset in the shop. But every time I thought about selling it, I felt like I was betraying something important, something I didn't understand yet. It was like Bo had left me a puzzle, and I was the only person who could solve it. The letter from First National Bank arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a postal worker who couldn't meet my eyes when he handed it over. I knew what it was before I opened it. You don't get thick envelopes with certified mail, stamps when the news is good, notice of default and intent to foreclose. The words hit me like a wrench to the gut. 90 days. That's all I had left to come up with. 3 months of missed payments plus penalties, or Mitchell's Auto Repair would become the property of First National Bank of Nebraska. The numbers at the bottom of the page might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the sense they made to my checking account balance. I sat in that too-quiet shop, surrounded by Bo's tools and his dreams and his coffee-stained paperwork, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself cry. Not the polite tears you shed at gravesides, but the ugly, angry kind that come when you realize the universe doesn't care how hard you're trying or how much something means to you. When Thad showed up for his weekly visit, I was still holding the letter. He read it over my shoulder while I pretended to work on a carburetor that didn't need fixing. "This is it, Cora. This is the sign you needed. You can't save this place." Hell, Bo probably couldn't save it if he were still alive. The whole town's dying anyway. Look around. Half the storefronts on Main Street are empty. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't right either. "I'm not giving up yet." "Then what's your plan?" "Because hope and determination don't pay banknotes." That's when I looked at the truck again. Really looked at it. The most valuable single thing in the shop, probably worth more than everything else combined if I could get it running and find the right buyer. Vintage Harley Davidson pickups were collector's items, especially if they were restored properly. I pulled the tarp off completely for the first time and started examining every inch of the truck with the kind of attention I usually reserved for diagnosing engine problems. What I found didn't make sense. The frame had been reinforced with additional steel plating, welded professionally but not by any factory. The suspension was heavy-duty, rated for loads far beyond what a standard pickup would need. Under the dashboard, I found switches that weren't connected to anything I could identify, and wiring that disappeared into panels that looked like they'd been custom installed. But the strangest thing was underneath. The truck had a false floor, constructed so skillfully that you'd never notice it unless you were lying on your back looking up. It wasn't hiding anything now, just empty space lined with foam padding, like it was designed to transport something fragile or valuable without anyone knowing. "Millie?" I called out when I saw her watering her garden that evening. "You remember when Bo got this truck?" She set down her watering can and walked over, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "That'd be 1975, I suppose. He took off for about 3 weeks that summer, didn't tell anyone where he was going. Came back with that truck and never talked about the trip. Your grandmother was furious with him for disappearing like that." "Did he ever say why he needed a truck with modifications like this?" Millie climbed up into the cab and ran her fingers over the dashboard switches. "He was different after that trip, quieter. Started getting mail from places I'd never heard of. Veterans organizations, I think. Always thought it was strange since Bo never served. Too young for Korea, too old for Vietnam. What kind of mail? Letters mostly, sometimes packages. He'd take them straight to his office and lock the door. Your grandmother used to joke that he was running some kind of secret business, but she stopped joking when she realized he wasn't making any money from whatever it was." That night, I made my decision. I was going to restore the truck, but not just to sell it. I needed to understand what Bo had been involved in, what these modifications were for, and why he'd kept it hidden for nearly 50 years. The bank could wait 90 days. Some mysteries are worth risking everything to solve. I spent the next 3 weeks living in that shop. Not literally, though there were nights when I fell asleep on the old couch in Bo's office, grease still caked under my fingernails, and my back aching from hours bent over the engine bay. Every morning I'd wake up with renewed determination to crack whatever code my grandfather had left behind. The engine was in better condition than I'd expected, like someone had been maintaining it regularly, even though it hadn't been driven in decades. The oil was old but not sludgy. The filters were dirty but not destroyed. It was as if Bo had been keeping it ready for something, just waiting for the right moment to bring it back to life. But it was the hidden compartments that really got my attention. The false floor wasn't the only modification. Behind the rear seat panel, I found another concealed space, this one lined with what looked like military-grade shock absorption material. The glove compartment had a false back, and even the spare tire well had been modified to hold something other than a tire. I documented everything with my phone, taking pictures of each discovery, measuring dimensions, trying to figure out what kinds of cargo these spaces were designed to hold. People? Supplies? Something valuable enough to justify this level of concealment? The breakthrough came on a Wednesday night when I finally got the engine to turn over. It coughed and sputtered at first, 48 years of sitting still protesting against the idea of movement. But then something clicked, and that V8 settled into the deepest, most satisfying rumble I'd ever heard. It wasn't just loud, it was distinctive. The kind of sound that would carry for blocks, that would make people stop what they were doing and look up from their newspapers or their dinner plates. I let it idle for 20 minutes, listening to the rhythm of the pistons, watching the temperature. Gauge climb to normal operating range. Everything worked. The lights, the radio, even the heater that blasted air so hot I had to crack a window. This truck was ready to drive, had probably been ready to drive for years. The next morning I made a decision that felt both completely logical and completely insane. I was going to take it for a test drive through town, see how it handled after all these years, and maybe drum up some interest from potential buyers. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was, I needed to feel what Bo had felt when he drove this truck. Needed to understand what had made him modify it so extensively and then hide it away. I spent that Thursday morning detailing every surface, polishing the chrome until it reflected the Nebraska sky like a mirror, scrubbing decades of dust from the wheel wells. By the time I was finished, the truck looked like it had just rolled off a showroom floor, if showroom floors had been selling mysterious orange pickups with secret compartments in 1975. But before I took it anywhere, I had to make a practical decision. I needed money, and sentiment wasn't going to pay the bank. So I created an online listing with all the photos I'd taken during the restoration. I wrote up a description that highlighted the truck's unique features without going into too much detail about what those features might have been used for. Fully restored 1975 Harley-Davidson pickup. Original paint, rebuilt engine, extensive custom modifications. One owner, garage kept. Serious inquiries only. I priced it high, figuring anyone interested in a truck like this would understand its value. $15,000. Enough to keep the shop open for another 6 months and give me time to build up a real customer base. It hurt to think about selling it, but keeping the shop meant more than solving whatever mystery Bo had left behind. I posted the listing on Thursday afternoon. Friday morning I fired up the engine one more time, put the truck in drive, and rolled out of that garage into the bright spring sunlight. The steering was tighter than I'd expected, the brakes responsive, the transmission smooth. Whatever Bo had used this truck for, he'd maintained it like his life depended on it. As I drove down Main Street, heads turned. People came out of the diner, the hardware store, the post office, all staring at this piece of their town's history that had been hidden away for nearly 50 years. I didn't know it yet, but one of those people was already reaching for their phone. 3 days after I posted the listing, I was elbow deep in a transmission rebuild when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who'd walked with purpose for a very long time. I looked up to see an older man standing in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun so I couldn't make out his features clearly. "You Mitchell's granddaughter?" His voice carried the weight of decades and something else I couldn't identify yet. "That's me, Cora Mitchell. You hear about the truck?" He stepped into the shop and I could see him properly for the first time. 70-something, silver hair cut military short, wearing clean jeans and a flannel shirt that had been pressed with the kind of precision that spoke to habits formed long ago. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They were fixed on the truck with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Vincent Castellano," he said, extending a hand that was calloused in all the same places mine were, just older. "People call me Vinny. I drove down from Columbus when I saw your posting. Long drive for a truck. You a collector?" He walked toward the Harley like he was approaching something sacred, his steps slowing as he got closer. When he reached out to touch the chrome bumper, his hand was shaking. "I'm not here to buy it," he said quietly. "I'm here because hearing that engine run again 3 days ago was the first time in 48 years I knew for certain that Bo Mitchell had kept his promise." The wrench in my hand suddenly felt too heavy. "You knew my grandfather?" Vinny ran his fingers along the truck's side panel, tracing lines only he could see. "Your grandfather saved my life with this truck. More than once, actually." "That's impossible." "Bo never served in the military. He told me stories about working in the shop during Vietnam, how he kept the home front running while other men went overseas." "He never served officially." Vinny opened the driver's side door and sat down, behind the wheel, his hands finding the steering wheel like they belonged there. "But he served in other ways. Ways that mattered more than anyone in uniform ever understood." I set down my tools and walked over to the passenger side. "What are you talking about?" 1975 was a bad year for a lot of us who came back from Southeast Asia. The government didn't want to acknowledge what we were dealing with. PTSD wasn't even a diagnosis yet. They just called us troublemakers or cowards or worse. Guys were killing themselves because they couldn't get help, couldn't get anyone to understand what they'd been through. Vinny's voice cracked slightly, and I realized his eyes were filling with tears. Your grandfather was part of a network, civilians who understood that the system was failing us. They used vehicles like this to move us around quietly, transport us to places where we could get real help, connect with other vets, find doctors who'd treat us without reporting back to the VA. He pointed to the dashboard switches I'd discovered. These controlled lights that could signal to other drivers in the network. The hidden compartments carried medical supplies, sometimes cash for guys who needed to disappear for a while until they got stable. The reinforced suspension? We weren't always in good shape when we needed transport. Sometimes guys were unconscious, sometimes violent from flashbacks. The truck had to be able to handle whatever condition we were in. Vinny pulled something from his jacket pocket. A worn leather journal, thick with yellowed pages and held together by a rubber band that had probably been replaced dozens of times. Bo told me that if this truck ever ran again, it would mean the right person had found it. Someone who understood that fixing broken things was about more than just engines and transmissions. He handed me the journal. He said that person would know what to do with this. I opened to the first page. In my grandfather's careful handwriting, I saw lists of names, addresses, phone numbers, bank account information, records of money collected and distributed, and at the top of the page, a single line that made my chest tight. For the ones who served and the ones who serve them still. I spent that entire night reading through Bo's journal by the light of the shop's fluorescent bulbs, Vincent sitting across from me in a folding chair, filling in details that the careful handwriting couldn't capture. The bank accounts my grandfather had maintained contained nearly $60,000, money that had been quietly collected from donors who understood what the network was doing, funds that had been waiting for someone to continue the work. He always said the shop would be part of it someday, Vinny explained as we went through page after page of records. Not the front operation, but the heart of something bigger. A place where guys could come to learn skills that would help them rebuild their lives. The next morning I called First National Bank and paid off the loan in full. The woman on the phone seemed confused that someone would want to pay early, but I didn't care about her confusion. For the first time in 6 months, Mitchell's Auto. Repair belonged completely to me, free and clear. But more importantly, I finally understood what it was supposed to become. Within 2 weeks, I'd converted the back section of the shop into a classroom space. Nothing fancy, just workbenches and tool sets and a whiteboard where I could diagram engine components and electrical systems. Vinny helped me reach out to veterans organizations across the state, letting them know we had something different to offer. The first class started with 5 students. Tommy Brennan, 24, who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and couldn't sleep through the night without waking up in cold sweats. Maria Santos, 26, who'd been a mechanic in the Army and was struggling to find civilian work that matched her skills. David Park, 31, who'd been home for 3 years but still jumped every time a car backfired. And Vinny, who'd been waiting 48 years to pay forward what Bo had given him. The thing about working on engines, I told them that, first day my hands already dirty from the transmission we were rebuilding together, is that it teaches you patience. Every bolt has to be turned in the right sequence, every connection has to be perfect, or nothing works. But when you get it, right, when all those pieces come together and that engine starts up, you know you've created something that wasn't there before. Tommy looked up from the carburetor he was cleaning. Sounds like what we're trying to do with ourselves. Exactly like that. The program grew. Word spread through veteran networks, and soon I was getting calls from across the Midwest. Some students came for the 6-week automotive certification course we'd developed. Others just needed a place to work with their hands while they figured out what came next in their lives. The shop became what Bo had always intended it to be, a Daisy, place where broken things got fixed and people remembered what they were capable of. Thad came by on a Wednesday in late summer, wearing one of his expensive ties and carrying a folder full of business projections he'd prepared to convince me to expand into a franchise model. You could have locations in 5 states within 2, Years, he said, watching Maria teach a newer student how to gap spark plugs. This could be bigger than anything Bo ever imagined. I looked around the shop, at students bent over engine blocks with the kind of focus that comes from having found something worth caring about, at Vinny patiently explaining the difference between torque specifications to someone who'd never held a socket wrench before. It's already bigger than Bo imagined, I told him, and it's exactly the right size. The 1975 Harley-Davidson pickup still sits in the front corner of the shop, its orange paint gleaming under the work lights. It's not for sale anymore, and it never will be. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important things we inherit aren't the ones we can see, and that the best way to honor someone's memory is to understand not just what they did, but why they did it. Every morning when I fire up that engine, to test it, the sound carries across the whole town. And every morning someone who needs to hear it finds their way to our door.